Hello, welcome to World Insight on CCTV News. I'm Wang Yijun in Beijing. Coming up on today's program, accusations are flying from hacking attempts to the war crimes in Syria. The U.S. and Russia are seeing strained relations. Could this be the biggest chill in relations since the Cold War? Meanwhile, China is seeking tighter relations with the U.S., especially in areas of defense and security. We sit down with Michael Swaine, one of the most prominent analysts in Chinese security studies, to hear his thoughts. We start today's show with the mounting tension between the U.S. and Russia. In a recent development, Russia has considered restoring military bases in Vietnam following U.S. warships making port calls there. But strained ties between the two powers runs a lot deeper. For one, the U.S. has accused Russia of a series of hacks, most recently into the systems of the Democratic National Committee. And secondly, both countries stand very differently on the complex situation in Syria. With these in mind, how will their relations pan out in the future? Have a look at this first.
Deteriorating ties, a new low. That sums up the current relations between U.S. and Russia. Last Saturday, the United Nations failed to pass two rival resolutions on Syria, backed by the West and Russia. And with that, Washington and Moscow are engaged in a new standoff over how to deal with the crisis.
We failed to do that because one of us, perversely the President of the United Nations Security Council, is intent on allowing the killing to continue and indeed participating in carrying it out.
Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov accused the U.S. of not trying its best in the fight against terrorists in Syria. He also admitted that the relationship between Russia and the U.S. has undergone fundamental changes.
We
have pointed to a fundamental change of circumstances, or more precisely, the aggressive anti-Russia tendencies of the U.S. policy on Russia. These anti-Russia tendencies are not limited to statements, but also include aggressive steps that have a direct bearing on our national interest and can affect our national security.
Besides differences over Syria, the cyber warfare between the two powers have become a new normal. The U.S. government has formally accused Russia of trying to interfere with the U.S. presidential election and has pointed fingers at Moscow after the Democratic Party's computer networks were hacked. The Kremlin immediately dismissed the accusations as nonsense. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said these claims were dirty tricks by Washington to whip up anti-Russia hysteria, adding that the accusations lack evidence. Ever since the U.S. and Russia butted heads with regards to Ukraine and Crimea, talk of a second Cold War has increased. And as both countries continue to stand differently on multiple complex issues, there's little chance of the heat between Washington and Moscow dissipating.
Now to discuss this, we have in our Beijing studio Mr. Alexander Luking, Professor and Director of East Asian and SCO Studies at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, as well as Mr. Cui Hongjian, Director of the Department for European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Kurt Volker, a former U.S. ambassador to NATO and now the CEO of McCain Institute for International Leadership. Welcome, gentlemen, to our program. So we've seen in the previous story there, our reporter said the U.S. has accused Russia of hacking into its Democratic National Committee's computer ahead of the November 8th election, and Russia has rebutted this accusation, saying it's complete nonsense and fan out anti-Russia hysteria. So let me start in Washington, D.C. there. Mr. Volker, what could be the likely truth?
Well, as I understand it, the intelligence services here have identified the specific means of attack, and that is a software that has been used by Russia in other cases of cyber attacks as well. And so they have very, very high confidence that it is in fact Russia or people operating out of Russia that have been behind these cyber attacks and then release of materials. So I think that's basically what it is. I also think that there is an element to which this plays in the political campaigns going on here. As you know, Donald Trump has made a point in his campaign of reaching out to Vladimir Putin, trying to say, well, we'll restore better relations. And I think that the Clinton campaign is trying to use the fact that Russia had hacked their emails as evidence of why we need to be concerned about Russian behavior.
But Russia has said that this is complete nonsense. Is there any rebuttal from you, Mr. Volkin? Mr. Volkin,
there is evidence.
Well, I don't know the truth, of course, because only experts could know. I know that there is no evidence, at least no evidence was presented to Russia. And we don't know if it's if they accuse Russian officials or some Russian citizens operating from Russia or from abroad. We don't know that. The only thing we know that the problem is not who stole something, but what is the contents of it. They are very afraid of this contents because the entire Washington establishment, including some Republicans, they are now supporting Clinton campaign. So they are very much afraid to, and they don't want this contents to be for the people to read it, and that's because it can harm Clinton campaign. That's why they are trying to find a scapegoat. So they found Russia because Trump, for some reason, was like telling some nice words about Putin. So I think we should look at this against the context of in the context of the internal situation in the United States.
Mr. Cui, if you would like to weigh in on this, how is this hacking accusation going to affect the presidential election? Because Clinton, of course, is against Russia regarding the issue in Syria and regarding this hacking. And Donald Trump has reached out to Russia saying we could probably work with Russia. That's not his exact word, but we can fight alongside with Russia in a Syrian war to topple the rebellions of whoever is making war and causing chaos in the country. So what is this going to turn out to be?
Yeah, firstly, I also think that so far for this criticisms from United States to Russia, still we need some truth or some proof, like a Russian side blamed, because also there is always a problem for this cyber attacks. It's so difficult to find out the real, the resources of attacking. Even our American colleagues, what they are saying is, logic is because Mr. Trump has some spoke about something good, something sweet about Mr. Putin. But now the question is, anyway, Mr. Trump will become the American president once he wins the election. So I don't know how is a personal feeling and how is a feeling from American president to Russia or to Mr. Putin. So still, we need some more truth. And another issue, I think that it's a very, very big showcase of how is a lack of mutual trust between those two countries. No matter which kind of issue could become very, very, big events between two countries to be, raised by each side and to become the target of criticized from other side like that.
Let's wait for more evidence and investigation for that cyber hack accusations. I want to turn to our DC guest there, Mr. Volker. So we are seeing a recent new low of relations between U.S. and Russia after the ceasefire that was failed in Syria. Is that the reason why we are seeing this chill?
The reason why you're seeing it is Russia's actions, and it's very important. I mean, when the U.S. just tells the truth about what Russia's doing, that is not anti-Russian behavior. That is just describing what's going on and saying that we are concerned about it. And the problem is that Russia keeps going, and so it has created a bigger divide in the relations than we've had for a long time. This is Russia's attacks inside Syria on Aleppo, together with the Assad regime. It has been the invasion of Ukraine, and occupation of part of that territory, and annexation of part of that territory. It has been the mock attacks on U.S. warships or on allied countries in Europe, the threat to use nuclear weapons, the propaganda that it has been pushing out against the United States. There's just a lot of things that Russia has done that have caused this level of concern in the U.S. There's no one in the U.S. that wants to be in a conflict with Russia, but at the same time, it's important that we actually speak up about what Russia is doing.
But at least we are seeing some kind of conflict between Russia and the U.S. Does this start with the annexation of Crimea, or when does this first new round of trials start?
I don't think so that it started. It was just like the highest point. But the problem with Russian-US relations is that we cannot have good relations in the American sense. This is a more fundamental problem. The American, by good relations, they mean that the country is dependent. Only with a dependent country they can have a good relationship. So when Russia, whenever it expressed in the 1990s its own opinion, which did not coincide with the United States one, it had problems, like with Yugoslavia, with the U.S. Invasion of Iraq, and many other problems. But Ukraine was just the last step, because they attacked, I can say, or they supported mostly the anti-Russian nationalist forces in our neighboring and friendly state. So this Russia could not tolerate. And I think that this period is actually, its characteristic as we are coming to a normal state of relationship with the United States. We cannot, the things will never be again as they were before. We'll have relationship without any kind of ideological or value or sharing of values. Our values are completely different or opposite. We can have, at some point we can talk about something like we did on Syria, but basically we can only have like something like what was called peaceful coexistence. We don't talk on values because it's ridiculous to talk about values with a completely ideological state as the United States is. We can talk about some specific issues.
Yes, let's talk about specific issues. Since you have very different values and very different stance regarding the Syrian war there, could there be a possible middle ground?
There could be a middle ground on some specific issues. If the United States understands that on that issue, it has some interest that it can share with the United States, we can go ahead. But we are not that much enthusiastic of, embracing each other as some Russians wanted in the 1990s. Like specific. We tried to work on Syria, but they rejected. We still work on some issues, like on Korea, for example, but we are not going to talk to them if they don't want to.
Who do you blame for the failure of the ceasefire?
In Syria?
Yes.
Oh, of course the United States, because their policy is absolutely illogical. They support at the same time, the ISIS and the enemies of ISIS, the Kurds, for example. So the only explanation of that is that their policy is ideologically led. There's no logic in it. And they want us to join this illogical policy. Of course we are not going to do it. We are fighting terrorists. Russia is fighting terrorists, and Russia is going to continue fighting all terrorists which are there.
Mr. Volker, our studio guest, Mr. Looking here, said blame the failure of the Syrian ceasefire to the U.S. And some would say that Syrians are now questioning what the U.S. true motive is in Syria, because the ceasefire has failed. The U.S. wants to bring an end to the war, a 5-year-old war in Syria, but not trying hard enough. What's your take on this?
Well, it's truly remarkable what Mr. Lukin has just said. So Russian forces are in Syria. They are bombing Aleppo. They are working with the Assad regime that has killed 500,000 or so people in the country, has displaced about 12 million people. And then Russia is saying that the United States is responsible for violating a ceasefire? That's insane. I think the problem with the United States, and here he did say something correct, I believe, is that the United States' position is illogical. We want to fight ISIS. We're not supporting ISIS. We want to fight ISIS and destroy ISIS. But we are trying to work with groups who are themselves being attacked by the Assad regime and who want to fight back against that, and we're telling them no. So we have this inconsistency of telling them don't fight against Assad even though he's attacking you, do fight against ISIS even though ISIS is not attacking them. And so that's the inconsistency. We have a policy of trying to get rid of ISIS. I think we need to also recognize that Assad is himself directly a problem, and it's going to take more U.S. intervention if this is ever going to be peaceful. Otherwise, Russia is going to continue supporting this regime and continuing that fighting inside the country, killing all the civilians and leveling the city of Aleppo that used to be Syria's largest city.
Mr. Cui here, as a third party, your suggestion on some kind of middle ground, some kind of midpoint for negotiation here.
But indeed, previously there was, window of opportunity to look for a middle ground between Russia and the United States in Syria. That is a, counter-terrorism, as we understand, since last September, when Russia involved into this Syria war, that it looks like, and also at that time, some Western countries, especially European countries, attacked by ISIL. So it looks like there are a very, very big opportunity for Western countries and Russia to, forge a, international alliance to fight against ISIL. But now, after almost 1 year, we find out that still both Russia and the United States, they could not avoid a fundamental divergence between them is how the position to the Assad regime in Syria. So far, I think that from the United States, still regard the Assad and Syria government as a part of target need to be dropped down. And from Russian side, still think that the opposition, would be, fight against as a part of terrorism organization like that. So big gap between two sides. So now I think that once we want a middle ground between two powers in Syria is, firstly, I think that some other countries, especially European countries, they could not burden this, very, very big threat from the, the turbulence in Syria and the Middle East. Once there are some more terrorism attacks happened in European countries, certainly, I think there will be more driving force from Western countries to ask United States have some more cooperation with Russia in Syria.
But just recently, Russian President Vladimir Putin has canceled his planned trip to France, mainly because of the Syrian issue that is on the table, that the European countries want to negotiate with Russia, but Russia refused to face it. Could this Syria issue be a driving of a broader confrontation between Russia, not just towards the US, but towards the whole West?
I don't think it can, because the United States cannot do anything. They don't have ground force, and they would be afraid to send ground forces there. The ground force, only Turkey has ground forces, but Turkey is now friendly to Russia, and it's friendly because they accuse the United States of instigating a military coup there. So their policies, as I said, the United States policy is a little bit illogical. I also think that many countries in the world are a little bit fed up with this hypocrisy. Well, my colleague said that from the United States that they don't support ISIS, but where did ISIS get all their weapons and the famous jeeps, for example? The United States gave their weapons to their friends who are supposed to be moderates, and these moderates immediately gave it to ISIS. Isn't it supporting ISIS? And then, now they're very much worried about the bombings of Aleppo. By the way, by a legitimate regime, internationally recognized government, which is fighting an insurgency. Well, they were not worried about Ukrainian army bombing Ukrainian cities. They're not worried now about Saudi Arabia bombing Yemeni cities, but now they're very much worried about Aleppo because they don't like the regime there. But I don't think that For example, if they stand for democracy, that Saudi Arabian regime is much more democratic than say, Assad regime. So this is all complete hypocrisy, and we don't want to subscribe to it. We are very sorry about it.
But after all, after these series of issues from Ukraine to Syria now, the relations between Russia and the U.S. are now at a new low. Some are describing this as a new Cold War. Is it a fair description, Mr. Volker, there?
Well, it's a term that Prime Minister Medvedev has used and others in Russia have used as well. He used it at the Munich Security Conference last February. It's a shame that Russia wants to be in a new Cold War. It's not what anyone else wants. We would like to be able to work together. But again, Russia's actions, the U.S. did not intervene in Ukraine, Russia did. The U.S. does not have ground troops and is actively fighting in Syria other than attacking ISIS, Russia is. The U.S. is not occupying part of Georgia, Russia is. So a lot of the concerns that we are talking about are directly because of Russia's intentional actions. And if you try to look, you're going to have a very hard time finding anything the U.S. has done other than point this out. If there's a complaint to be had about the U.S. position or the Western position, is that it's weak compared to what Russia is doing.
Mr. Cui here, as a third party, do you see a Cold War here? And especially with the upcoming November the 8th presidential election, how will this relation between U.S. and Russia head?
Yes. Also, besides the concept or definition of a Cold War, there is another word to describe the relations between Russia and the United States is cold peace. Which means that certainly I don't think it's a time, because we are living in a globalized time. I don't think it's a good time for this Cold War era between those two powers. But certainly now recently it looks like there are more and more factors of confrontation between two powers. If we understand what happened recently, especially from American side, from the Russian side. For example, in the last in this June, there is some more aggressive, attitude from NATO to Russia, and also response from Russia. Recently, Russia proposed, or Russia was thinking the possibility to restart the military bases in Cuba and Vietnam. If those all of these thinkings or some proposals become true, certainly I think that perhaps there will be more possibility to have a Cold War between two powers. But I think now, at the same time, we need also some other, efforts from international community to stop this direction and the tendency between those two powers.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this part of discussion here. And I hope, gentlemen, you can agree with this term, cold peace, Mr. Cui here, as mentioned. Thank you very much. That was Mr. Alexander Lukin and Mr. Cui Hongquan here in the studio, and in Washington, D.C., Mr. Kurt Volker. Stay with us here on World Insight, still to come. In the landscape of global security threats, how can the two largest economies team up? We chat with Michael Swaine, one of the most prominent analysts in Chinese security studies, on China-U.S. military partnership. Stay with us. Now we take a look at another key partnership, China-U.S. In recent years, there has been a rapid development in ties as both China and the U.S. seek to build a new model of big power relationship. However, differences still remain on a number of issues, especially in military and security. We'll dig deep into the efforts made by both to push mutual trust, but first, let's take a look at the nature of this relationship.
The Pacific Ocean is vast enough for two large countries. Chinese President Xi Jinping believes so, and military ties between China and the U.S. prove it. Through state visits by top leaders and high-level military exchanges, both nations are trying to pave the way for increased cooperation and new mechanisms to minimize risks. Among their achievements is a code of conduct. It governs unexpected encounters between the navies on the open seas.
To build strategic trust, first of all, you need to control and manage possible conflicts so that frictions, conflict will not become military confrontation. That is very important.
But constant challenges remain. The U.S. military engages in actions that China views as confrontational. These range from close surveillance of China's coastal regions to regular arms sales to Taiwan, from openly criticizing China over the South China Sea disputes to cybersecurity issues. While such differences are likely to remain in the long run, the two countries agree on seeking common understanding.
Two people can't be dominant at the same time. So I think we'll have to find a way to work with each other, exchange views on the things that trouble us, ask China to tell us more with respect to transparency on their military activities and the issue of the islands.
Sincere dialogue to avoid direct conflict, that's how both China and the US are responding to security uncertainties. And the one undeniable thing, after all, is that a tranquil Pacific Ocean is not only good for both countries, but also for the entire world.
Regarding this issue, during the two-day Xiangshan Forum held earlier this week in Beijing, my colleague Tian Wei spoke with Dr. Michael Swaine, a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and one of the most prominent American analysts in the Chinese security studies. He shared on the ideal situation of China-U.S. relations and how military cooperation can be strengthened.
Dr. Swaine, welcome to CCTV News.
Thank you.
You have some specific proposals about what the Western Hemisphere should be like with the balance of power. Tell us about your blueprint.
Well, I think the United States and China are moving towards a balance of power in reality already in the region. That is, China's capabilities, economic, military, are growing relative to the United States. In the past, the U.S. had a more dominant position in the maritime area, in the oceans. It's becoming more equal now. So I'm saying that there needs to be a deliberate effort to establish a stable balance of power, not an unstable balance of power. And to do that, I think the U.S. and China have to agree on a certain set of conditions.
Before we go to a certain set of conditions, let's talk about the equal, the adjective you use. What exactly are you referring to?
What I'm referring to is a combination of two things. One, the economic power of the two countries in the region. China's economic strength in the region has obviously grown in very significant ways in the last 30 years under the reforms. The United States is still a major economic power in the region, but relative to China, its strength economically, I think, has diminished. It doesn't have quite the leverage, quite the influence in trade, investment in the area than the Chinese do. The Chinese are way behind on the investment side, but on the trade side, they're not.
So that's the economy.
That's the economic. And the other side of it is the military, both military and paramilitary, if you will, Coast Guard and that sort of thing. China has increased its strength both in its Air Force and its Navy in significant ways, particularly along its coastline. And the United States has also, to some degree, increased, but not all that much. And it's not going to be able to spend that much more to stay ahead of China in the future. So the Chinese military and Coast Guard is going to really establish parity with the U.S. and with Japan over the next 20 years or so. So I'm talking about long-term trends here. I'm not talking about the here and now. I'm talking about what's going to happen over the next 20, 25 years.
Then tell us about this balance. How is that likely to be?
Well, I think the first thing has to be a recognition in the countries involved, China, the US, Japan, and others, that this balance is in fact emerging. Some don't even believe that that's what's happening. Some think that China's economy is going to decline, China will not continue to grow, etc. So first thing has to recognize the problem. Second thing has to recognize that you've got to do more than just what's called muddling through, just sort of dealing with each individual problem as it occurs in a kind of piecemeal way. You've got to have a broader strategy for establishing a balance. What that means is the two militaries have to adopt a more defensive posture towards each other. That's one thing. Secondly, they have to reach certain very specific understandings about these hotspot issues in the Western Pacific, from Korea all the way down to the South China Sea. That's going to take time. This is not something that can happen overnight. It can't happen like a grand bargain, as it's said. It has to happen incrementally through a process of trial and error and feeling the way along.
Michael, let's take a look at some of the words you have just used. Defensive militaries for China and the United States. Is that really likely to happen, given the fact that the U.S. still considers itself playing an extremely important role in the Asia-Pacific region? And China embraced that. However, there probably is different planning about the future.
Yes, I think that's very true. The U.S. military has long held a military doctrine, military belief, that is offensively oriented. Overseas power and projecting power in a way that you act early and you seize the initiative, you win. In the Western Pacific, I think there's going to have to be a transition to a posture that is less oriented towards controlling and more oriented towards denying the other side some kind of area that you wouldn't want it to have. So you have to have a more defensive-oriented posture. It doesn't mean that you remove your military from the area. It just means you change the posture of it.
Give me some examples. What can happen with the U.S. military, for example?
The example would be that you put more emphasis on the ground defense of territory, Japanese home islands, and also on submarine type of capabilities as opposed to aircraft carriers and forward deployed destroyers. You have a relatively smaller number that are balanced against each other, and you have them in a doctrine that is not escalatory. In other words, you don't immediately try to seize the initiative and take the fight to the other side. You don't, for example, in a real serious crisis over Taiwan, you don't attack the Chinese mainland, and China does not attack the United States. You really focus on dealing with each other's military capabilities in the area, denying them the ability to succeed. So you have a balance of defensive forces in that way.
But any of those examples you have just raised keep my heart bouncing very fast. For example, the conflict of Taiwan. What do you make of these some very real and strategic issues in the Asia-Pacific region? You've got the DPRK issue, you've got South China Sea just recently popping up. You also got Taiwan, Japan, all of these issues. They are intertwined. They have a lot to do with the recent interactions. Also, they will cast their shadows about the future development.
Oh, sure.
What do you make of these recent phenomena, their impact on the overall planning and the strategic thinking?
Well, I think all of these issues are really key to establishing a stable balance. Right now, you point to each of these as being the only real source of real confrontation between the U.S. and China. Over Korea, I doubt very much the U.S. and China would actually have conflict over Korea. But you could have a very messy situation there that could lead to the two countries taking actions that the other regard as threatening. And they could then escalate their positions. You want to avoid getting into that situation. The U.S. and China need to talk very seriously about future contingencies. What if certain things happen? How do you respond? How would we respond? There has to be an understanding about that.
Do we have experiences earlier about this?
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, do countries have any previous experience about this?
Sure.
Give us examples.
Well, you can have, in the past, you've had understandings that have been reached between major powers about exercising a certain amount of restraint in dealing, for example, between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. They had certain kinds of confidence building measures where they would indicate that they would not do certain things. If there was a crisis of some kind, they would not alert certain forces. They would not do certain other things. So you have a history of precedent where countries can talk to each other to try and reassure each other. It's not just something you do on your own and expect the other side is going to do their own thing.
But several things. One is China, of course, is not comparable to Soviet Union, early Soviet Union, when it comes to its relations with the United States. That's one point. Secondly, Cold War lasted for a long time. So you really got a lot of time, capital, in order to invest into all of these negotiations and code of conducts and rules. And now China rises, the U.S. certainly responded. These things happen very fast. So the thing you have proposed, is it possible, once again, given the fast-paced changes happening all the time?
Yes, I think it is possible, but it's not going to happen overnight. I don't think we are in such a dire situation in the relationship today that you must have all of this happen in the next year, 2 years, even 5 years. It's going to be a long process. It's going to be gradual. But you have to have a deliberate decision made by the countries involved that they're going to seek this kind of balance. If they don't do that, if they just assume that the two sides will establish a natural balance, I think it will be unstable because each side will test the other.
Exactly.
Its relative capabilities. And if you don't have a sense of really concrete reassurance, limits on deployments, limits in policy terms. For example, you have to talk about the long-term future of Korea. What is the future of the Korean Peninsula long-term? I think it's going to be a unified peninsula, and one that is going to be not entirely without any sort of alliance with the United States. It will lean towards the U.S., but you won't have any U.S. forces on the Korean Peninsula.
A lot of scenarios over there, but one of the things, Michael, is important is who is likely to act first. You talk about defensive, make the militaries. So will the Chinese do that first, or will the U.S. do that first? Or are they going to establish a mechanism in which they can both monitor the others to follow the steps?
Right. Well, the whole point is you don't want one side or the other to act first, particularly in a military way. You want to make sure that the two sides don't look at a problem like Korea and say, we have to use our military to establish our position or to defend our position. You've got to be able to have an environment where the two sides feel reassured that you're not going to result in that kind of situation. So that requires understanding. You can't do it indirectly by just assuming the other side will restrain themselves. You have to understand limits.
So defensive. What are the other proposals that you are having toward a better future, as you said, balance of power?
Well, one other proposal is that the region has to become even more integrated economically. So
haven't they already?
No, it's not nearly as far as it should be.
Tell us more.
It needs to have ultimately an Asia-Pacific free trade area. We don't have that today. We have individual bilateral free trade arrangements. We have some more ambitious notions like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Program, but these are still...
The former has some legal issues, the latter, of course, in the process. We don't know yet.
Exactly. And I'm saying there has to be a more deliberate effort to try and make that process not only develop, but the U.S. and China converge in it. They both have to be members of these kinds of multi-nation economic organizations. China needs to be a member of TPP. The U.S., of course, will be a member of it, but you have to get there gradually, and that's going to take some time.
It's not going to be.
Yes.
We could have.
Well,
that's a precondition.
the major problem of that right now is the United States.
It's in Washington right now. Yeah, you know that better than I do. But, you know, talking about all of this, Michael, you seem to suggest that countries and politics are being run in an orderly way. But it's not.
Yes.
Dr. Swaine, it's not. So what's going to happen? What about that proposal under the current circumstances?
Under the current circumstances, I think it's very difficult to actually get this kind of a comprehensive assessment and
strategic thinking.
Strategic thinking. First, you have to be able to stabilize to some greater degree the hotspots. South China Sea is the most important. Right now, there needs to be understanding between the United States and China about the limits on military operations. Yeah. Both sides need to put things on the table. They have to reach a deliberate understanding about limits in this area. They haven't done that. And so that is the first step that needs to happen. I think there needs to be something similar to that regarding the Taiwan Strait. I am a believer in the fact the United States and China need to talk to each other about limiting their defensive deployments and their military assistance across the Taiwan Strait. They haven't done that. It's a very hard thing to do, but I think ultimately it's going to have to be done.
You see the rise of nationalism, the rise of populism in your country's politics, in many other countries as well. At this stage, is strategic thinking still possible?
I think so. I definitely think so.
What does it take?
What I think it takes is a leadership, not just in the United States, but also in China, that takes the long-term view and takes a view of really seriously talking to the other side, interacting with the other side, and telling the population of what the interests are in doing that. You have to communicate with your own public in a better way. I think the Chinese government doesn't do a good job of that personally in its own domestic situation. It plays too much to an extreme form of nationalism, which I think is not healthy. I think the United States, by its same token, is too resistant now to like trade deals and accommodation or reconciliation on some issues with China. Right now in the United States, if you talk about some kind of mutual recognition or mutual accommodation, people don't support that notion. They think it means that you're appeasing China, and you're not appeasing China. This has to be done from a position of strength.
Final question for you, Dr. Swaine, also briefly from you. You are one of those who knows China very well. But forgive me if I to say so. Many of you now in Washington are not popular because they would regard you as too close to China to have a fair judgment about the U.S. future. What would you say?
Well, I would say that people have to stop labeling people. They have to stop just calling a person pro-China, anti-China. I think that happens in China.
Not black and white.
Many Chinese people look at somebody like myself, my colleagues, and they'll say, oh, he's either a friend of China or he's not a friend of China. We have an interest in a cooperative relationship, and that involves doing things that are serving the interests of both countries. And if that is called being too pro-China, then I guess I'm too pro-China.
Dr. Swaine, thank you so much for being with us. All the best to your blueprint. Thank
you.
Thank you so much.
Well, that's all we have for today. If you'd like to see more, you can visit our website. Just type World Insights CCTV News into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. From me, Wang Yizhi, and everyone else here in World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next week for more insight from China and around the world. Goodbye.